This video will discuss the market revolution, a drastic shift in the U.S. economy marked by improvements in transportation, communication, and industry. With the growth of large-scale domestic manufacturing, internal trade will increase, decreasing American dependence on foreign imports. There was also a dramatic change in labor and production, as well as an agricultural explosion, coupled with a textile boom that strengthened the economy. The United States was growing much more rapidly than Britain or even Europe. One major reason was improvements in public health. The number of epidemics declined, as well as the nation's mortality rate. The population growth was also a result of a high birth rate. In 1840, women gave birth to an average of 6 children each, considerably higher than that rate today, which is less than 2. The second major factor leading to population growth in the U.S. was immigration. Very few European immigrants came to the U.S. prior to 1820 due to wars and economic crisis. Cheaper transportation and increased economic opportunities in America led to a boom in immigration until the Civil War. Between 1820 and 1860, 4 million people from Northern Europe crossed the Atlantic to seek a new life in the U.S. They entered the U.S. at Boston, New York City, and Philadelphia. Many immigrants remained there, where they landed, like the Irish, who tended to stay in cities. Others, like the Germans, moved to the farms and cities of the old Northwest Territory. Few went south. Slavery kept them out of those areas. No opportunities for a poor immigrant. Immigration increased because of the cost of transportation decreased. The Irish potato famine and revolutions in Germany in 1848 drove out people from their homelands, and many sought economic opportunities and political freedom. The immigrants strengthened the U.S. economy by providing both a steady stream of cheap labor and an increased demand for mass-produced consumer goods. 2 million Irish immigrants entered the country. They were mostly tenant farmers who left Ireland because of the potato famine. They were unskilled, had little money, uneducated, and were Catholic. They competed with African Americans for jobs. Many entered local politics and organized their fellow immigrants and joined the Democratic Party. 1 million Germans sought refuge from economic hardships and the failure of political revolutions in 1848. German immigrants were generally wealthier than the Irish. They were more educated and had more skills. They moved west in search of cheap, fertile farmland and established homesteads throughout the old Northwest Territory. They too were Catholics and opposed slavery. As you can see in the map, Americans moved west between 1820 and 1830. This was a result of immigration and new farmland opening in the old Northwest Territory. The urbanization was also a result of the opening of the Erie Canal and other canal systems in the Midwest. Native-born Americans were alarmed by the influx of immigrants, fearing that the newcomers would take their jobs and weaken the culture of the Protestant majority. These nativists were Protestants who distrusted Catholicism. Eventually, an anti-immigrant political party formed, the Know Nothing Party, which would fade away in the 1850s as slavery took center stage in American politics. It was primarily an anti-Catholic, anti-immigration, and xenophobic movement, originally starting as a secret society. The Know Nothing movement also briefly emerged as a major political party in the form of the American Party. Adherents to the movement were simply to reply, "I know nothing," when asked about its specifics by outsiders, providing the group with its common name. Supporters of the Know Nothing movement believed that an alleged Romanist conspiracy was being planned to subvert civil and religious liberty in the United States, and sought to politically organize native-born Protestants in what they described as a defense of their traditional religious and political values. Large-scale immigration of the Irish meant cheap labor, more drinking and fighting, cursing, and alleged cheating on spouses. Native-born Americans feared having their children exposed to the children of immigrants and their parents. The Irish entered local politics, ran most of the bars, were often corrupt when it came to getting out the vote. How were the Irish and Germans perceived by most Americans? Well, they were Catholics in a nation of Protestants. Though Christians, they had different values. What effects did improved transportation have on the economy? Roads connected north and south, which was important for trade and exchange of ideas. The Cumberland Road, also known as the National Road or National Turnpike, was the first road in the history of the United States funded by the federal government. President Thomas Jefferson promoted the road to support westward expansion and unify the developing nation. and Congress authorized its construction in 1806. Steamships used on the big river systems in the South, which catered to the plantation system. They carried bulk, so producers had to increase volume to compete with bigger producers. Robert Fulton's steamboat, the Clermont, was undoubtedly the pioneer of practical steamboats. In 1801, Robert Fulton partnered with Robert Livingston to build the Clermont. Livingston had received the monopoly on steam navigation on the rivers of New York State for 20 years, provided that he produced a steam-powered vessel able to travel 4 miles an hour. Canals linked the major waterways in the Midwest, the Ohio River to the Great Lakes. The big one was the Erie Canal, which connected the eastern manufacturing centers to the farms of the Old Northwest, replacing the connection of the Ohio River Valley to the south through the Mississippi River. The Old Northwest, or the Midwest, will grow together economically with the New England, as each section provided something the other needed more cheaply. Before the Erie Canal, the Ohio Valley brought their manufactured goods from the south, who bought their goods from Britain. Those goods were shipped by steamship up the Mississippi River over the Ohio. With the Erie Canal, goods became cheaper and changed the patterns of trade. Politically, the two sections will also share many views. Railroads will eventually replace the canals, as most will be built on an east-west axis. In the north, trunk lines were built connecting the major cities. In the south, feeder lines were built connecting the farms to the cities. Lines that connected the north to the south were built up until 1831 with Nat Turner's Rebellion. From that point on, a separate width in the tracks, the gauge, was used to keep abolitionists out of the South as well as their literature, but mainly to keep slaves from running away to freedom in the North. In the South, the railroads many times connected to nothing, a plantation to a river system. Cheap land brought a boom, which led to more farms and new businesses. Once the market was saturated and all the money had been loaned out to continue the boom, the economy went bust. All businesses had to keep growing in size to be competitive. State banks encouraged speculation and loaned out lots of money locally. Yes, the economy grew, but with a hazard. Few knew when the bubble would burst, leaving banks and debtors broke. The economy grew fast, in steep peaks, but also had steep slides. The Bank of the U.S. kept most of the money in the North, where it was invested in manufacturing, not so much in land. Folks who lived in the South and the West often had to borrow money at higher interest rates. Farmers, who were never guaranteed that they could pay off their loans as their crops may not yield what they expected. This made the Bank of the United States appear to be a tool of the Eastern elite. What it did was made it harder for land speculation and real estate bubbles. The economy grew, but more slowly. It had fewer steep peaks and few valleys. It was a stabilizing influence on economic growth. When Samuel Slater emigrated from Britain, he took with him the British secrets for building cotton spinning machines, and he put his knowledge to work by establishing the first U.S. factory in 1791. Early in the next century, the embargo in the War of 1812 stimulated domestic manufacturing, and the protective tariffs enacted by Congress helped the new factories prosper. Henry Clay's American system allowed for the funding of industrialization through protective tariffs, which funded the internal improvements that contributed to economic growth. The National Bank provided loans to start up businesses that facilitated more economic growth. Another cause was the growth of corporations. A corporation is formed when individuals pool their money for shares of the corporation, which in turn creates a right to a portion of the profits. Generally, the losses incurred by a shareholder of a corporation are limited to the amount that was invested. This concept is known as limited liability. Limited liability allows individuals to avoid personal responsibility for a business's losses. Corporations also allow individuals to pool resources to achieve goals that would be unattainable by a person acting alone and can last longer than an individual's lifetime. Wall Street became the economic capital of America following the completion of the Erie Canal. Investment in companies began to grow, and this led to further economic growth. Public land sales increased throughout the 1830s when the federal government confiscated Native American land and sold it to average Americans and wealthy investors. It led to a period of Western growth and fueled the economic boom prior to Jackson's administration. A number of different factors influenced industrialization in the United States during the Market Revolution. First, the Embargo Act of 1807, aimed at hurting the British, led the U.S. to rely more heavily on domestic manufacturing over imports. This, of course, coupled with the introduction of the factory system by Samuel Slater, increased industrialization. Third, the introduction of new technology facilitated industrial growth. New inventions like the cotton gin, spinning jenny, and interchangeable parts improved manufacturing. Steamships, canals, railroads, and the telegraph improved transportation and communication. Fourth, government policy, more specifically the American system, helped push all of these factors forward. Fifth, population growth allowed industry to grow with an ample supply of workers. Next, the availability of Western land that was easily attainable made starting factories much easier. Finally, there was plenty of capital to be found. Quick sources of investment money made starting a business easier than it had been in the past. Lowell, Massachusetts, named in honor of Francis Cabot Lowell, was founded in the early 1820s as a planned town for the manufacture of textiles. It introduced a new system of integrating manufacturing to the United States and established new patterns of employment and urban development that were soon replicated around New England and elsewhere. By 1840, the factories in Lowell employed some estimates of more than 8,000 textile workers, commonly known as mill girls or factory girls. These operatives, so called because they operated the looms and other machinery, were primarily women and children from farming backgrounds. The Lowell mills were the first hint of the Industrial Revolution to come to the United States, and with their success came two different views of the factories. For many of the mill girls, employment brought a sense of freedom. Unlike most women of that era, they were free from paternal authority, were able to earn their own money, and had broader educational opportunities. Many observers saw this challenge to the traditional roles of women as a threat to the American way of life. Others criticized the entire wage labor factory system as a form of slavery and actively condemned and campaigned against the harsh working conditions and long hours and the increasing divisions between workers and factory owners. Commonwealth versus Hunt was a Massachusetts Supreme Court case in 1842. Prior to this case, workers had been fighting to organize and create closed shops, businesses that required its workers to join the union to increase membership and effectiveness. Those attempts had been thwarted until now. In this case, the court ruled that trade unions were legal and had the right to strike or take other steps of peaceful coercion to raise wages and ban non-union workers. This was seen as a victory for labor unions, who had been largely unsuccessful at obtaining better working conditions for workers across the country. The cult of domesticity was a philosophy that sought to define gender roles in the 19th century. This philosophy took the position that there were separate spheres that regulated gender roles in American society. The philosophy was largely accepted by the middle and upper classes. Fundamentally, the cult held that a woman's place was in the home, where her superior virtue was to create a strong, morally uplifting environment for her children and husband, whereas a man's place was in the more corrupting and violent world of work and public affairs, where he alone should support the family. The emergence of a national market economy in the 19th century led to the decline of home production, as men took jobs in the manufacturing and commercial sectors. This meant that the middle and upper class women were no longer agents of production and could concentrate on creating a nurturing home environment. In this role, it was believed that women had a superior moral virtue to men, and this was demonstrated by domesticity, piety, purity, and submissiveness. If women moved outside this role, for instance, by engaging in politics or public speaking, they were said by many to unsex themselves. It should be remembered that the cult of domesticity was something that middle and upper class women aspired to. Poor women, particularly poor immigrant women, worked long hours in dangerous conditions for low pay, and they had nothing else to look forward to in their entire life but dangerous jobs for low pay. Many lower class women aspired to tend to a home because it was a stable, safe, and secure place for daily life, much to the contrary of working a dangerous factory.